Welcome back, everyone. I originally figured we should start 2018 with an iconic game which aged really poorly, but much to my surprise, today's ancient DOS game, Test Drive, is one of the very few games out there which plays significantly better emulated than on real hardware. And I've actually wanted to cover this game for quite some time now, since it was the very first game Dad ever bought for our Tandy 1000 SX computer back in the 80s. But there have been some things holding me back. First, the condition of my original discs. I have all three of them here, two 5¼ discs and one 3½ disc. Although these discs may be surprising a number of you right now who are familiar with the game because they have no mention of EGA on them. Well, I actually have a special 1988 release of the game which contains everything necessary to play it using Tandy graphics. And I should point out, it's only the graphics support which has been extended, as it does not support Tandy 3 voice or sound. It still just uses the PC speaker. So I wanted to cover my specific version since it has some very minor differences to the original release, but given that these discs are 30 years old and have seen all kinds of nasty storage conditions over the years, they're not in the greatest of shape, and they're not working right anymore. Well, at least the 5¼ discs. The 3½ disc I haven't even attempted to check because the disc film itself is slightly discoloring and has a couple tiny pits and cracks in it, so I don't want to stick it in a drive and inadvertently damage either of them in the process. Though quite frankly, it's not like I didn't try years ago before I even started ADG, when I discovered that, because of how widely unknown the Tandy version is, there's zero details out there on how to crack the copy protection and get it working without needing the actual discs. Many details for the EGA release, none for which work with this one. So I pretty much resorted to a Ware's copy of the original release for this video, but I already own a legit copy, so who even cares really? But yeah, the takeaway lesson here is back up your crud, even if the copy protection isn't going to let you play it, because these discs aren't getting any younger and the medium was never meant to last this long. I wouldn't be surprised if most of my 5¼ discs are failing by this point. Test Drive was developed by Distinctive Software and originally released by Accolade in 1987 on a variety of computer systems, not just DOS. And it's a one-player driving game, not a racing game, and originally supported Hercules Monochrome, CGA 4-color, and EGA 16-color graphics, along with PC speaker sound. Though, as I already pointed out, my actual copy also has Tandy 16-color graphics support. As for its current release date, just like virtually everything published through Accolade, it was never made freeware and so is still technically commercial software, but good luck finding a copy. Given the sheer number of sequels and the fact that there's no subtitle for this game, you have to sort through hundreds of search results for all the other games in the series when you try to hunt this one down. I managed to find a single fully boxed copy of the Amiga version for $25, but that was it. So I have no idea how much the DOS version would go for if you manage to find it. On the plus side, the box art for the game is very distinctive and easy to pick out from the other games in the series, so visually scanning any search results for the right box isn't really as hard. So let's get this out of the way. Despite everything I'm about to say, Test Drive is a highly significant game for a very particular reason. It's the first DOS game ever to feature driving a car from a first-person perspective. Now, there were other first-person games before this one for other purposes, and even first-person driving games in the arcades. But as far as I can tell, this was the first for DOS. Well, this and Ford Simulator, but I mean, come on. One only lets you drive Ford vehicles, but here in Test Drive, you have a selection of not one, not two, but 5 real sports cars. The Lamborghini Countach, the Lotus Esprit, the Porsche 911, the Ferrari Testarossa, and the Chevy Corvette. And wouldn't you know it, they all behave the exact same. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's talk about what you do in this game. The premise is that you're a software developer who's made $1 million, so it's time to go treat yourself with a brand new sports car. But you're not sure which to pick from at the dealership. Now, I find it odd that this so-called dealer somehow managed to have 5 totally differently branded high-end sports cars ready to purchase, but that's beside the point. The idea is that you're taking the car out for a test drive on a mountain pass, and if you can make it through the pass and back to the dealership in one piece, and in record time, you can keep the car. The car's even equipped with a police radar detector, because that's a totally legal thing you'll find on a sports car. Yeah, there's gotta be something really shady going on here. I mean, geez, if you obey the signage, stay in your lane, and never exceed the speed limit, they'll take the car away from you because you drive too slowly to own a sports car. Seriously, I tested this, and this actually happened with the game ending right here. Basically, the mountain pass has the mountain on one side and a sheer cliff on the other, and getting too close to either is instant death, as is rear-ending or front-ending anyone. Actually, I do find it hilarious how if you do hit anyone head-on, they have this expression on their face like, ah! Oh, I guess that didn't actually happen? Huh. Well, here's the deal. You actually get some extra lives. You start the game with 5 lives, run out, and the game is over. But there's no indication anywhere as to how many lives you actually have left. And since you get additional lives when you reach the gas station checkpoints along the route, it's kinda easy to lose track. Although, be careful with the police cars. If you're going full speed, you'll never have to worry about the cops, because every car in the game can easily outrun them. But if per chance they do get in front of you, you'll be unable to go any faster, otherwise you'll smash into them, and you'll get an instant game over no matter how many lives you have left. Although ironically, what's supposed to happen once they get in front is that they should slow down to force you to come to a stop, but here in the DOS version they simply go whatever speed you're going and slow down as you slow down. If you slow down. So if you can make it to a checkpoint with them in front of you and without going any faster, then you're actually still good. Although again, if you're playing right, the cops should never be an issue, thus why I don't actually have any footage of them getting in front of me. The mountain pass itself is the same every single time with 5 sections, each ending with a gas station checkpoint where you'll get scored based on how fast you made it through the section, and then ultimately the dealership at the end. The entire circuit takes about 12 to 14 minutes, so once you have this game dialed in, there's really not a lot to go wrong, other than the oncoming traffic, which does have some semblance of randomness to it. Well, even the police radar checks are in the exact same spots. Even the potholes and rain slicks and whatever those are, they're all in the same spots every time, and don't actually do anything. So, yeah, when you're at the gas stations, they give you some very brain-dead and almost useless tips every time. Now, the first of these gems is, watch out for potholes, which is useless since the road obstacles in this game literally have 0 effect on the car. They're even mentioned in the manual, which makes me suspect that they wanted to add them in as like actual obstacles to affect the car, but ran out of time and had to get the game out before these features are ready. The next is, watch out for radar. Again, pointless because you can easily outrun the cops. The last is, watch out for oncoming traffic. As if I need a freaking gas station attendant to tell me that. Okay, maybe I did. And that is ultimately one thing that sucks about this game, is that there's virtually no replay value after you beat it the first time. I mean, you could try driving the other cars, but... Oh yeah, you guys saw this one coming a mile away. The controls in this game are horrendous. Well, at least not without some tweaks. Although before we talk about the controls themselves, let's quickly discuss what's up with the driving physics and why all the cars behave pretty much identically. Now, every car you can choose from has a screen which shows all kinds of fancy stats about the vehicle in question. Well, to simplify things, let me blank out every piece of information which has no effect on the gameplay. Yeah, the tires, the torque, none of that really matters. The game physics work on a system where the faster you're going, the less sharply you can turn before you start to lose speed, and in the process lose some turning grip, forcing you to turn even harder. That's really the only point worth noting. There's no skidding, no spinning out, no losing control, none of that. So what the physics model ultimately comes down to is going fast and turning hard when you need to, and you're pretty much set. Although there is one other thing we should talk about too before we get to the controls themselves, and it's kind of something that might trip up a number of people trying to play this game, especially nowadays. Every car in this game is manual transmission. There are no automatics here, which, okay, yeah, it's understandable for these kinds of vehicles, but from a game design standpoint, you're immediately limiting your audience by not having an automatic option to help ease in new players who have zero experience with a stick. Not to mention the RPM in this game is, again, greatly simplified, in that there's a specific RPM which blows the engine of each vehicle, and unless you hit it, you're good, even if you spend the entire time just one tick below this maximum well past the red line. The engine will not blow, and everything will go fine. So, controls. The keyboard controls have buttons to turn, accelerate, brake, and 2 different buttons to shift up and shift down. Sounds straightforward, right? And hey, the controls are in simple to use spots, so doubly great, right? And hey, no pesky custom keyboard handler to get in the way, just going with the default BIOS keyboard handling, so triply great, right? Yeah, you heard me. The game doesn't use a custom keyboard handler, and anyone who knows anything about how DOS systems handled keyboard input is facepalming really hard as we speak. The default keyboard handling on a DOS PC is meant for typing, so anytime you hit a key, there's a debounce before the key is allowed to repeat continually, usually on the order of a quarter second to a half second depending on the BIOS settings. And if that wasn't bad enough, the system can only detect one key at a time, so if you're holding up to accelerate and then hold left to turn left, you cancel the acceleration key, and as far as the system is concerned, you just pressed left for an instant, and then a quarter second later, you're now holding left. Seriously, this fact alone makes the game borderline unplayable with the keyboard controls. You can do it, don't get me wrong, but it involves repeatedly tapping the controls and is liable to give you hand cramps very quickly. So that leaves you with the joystick controls, which kinda aren't much better. Since you have to manually shift, and since the game was designed specifically for one-button joysticks, you have to hold up to accelerate, down to brake, left or right to turn left or right, and the button will either shift up or down depending on if you're accelerating or braking when you hit the button. Holding up or down while trying to steer just makes steering excessively difficult. Not to mention, if you're trying to accelerate or brake, you're very liable to push sideways just enough to screw up your steering. And unlike as you would expect with joystick controls in a driving game, left and right don't affect the steering wheel position absolutely, but relatively. Meaning you hold left or right to turn the wheel more to the left or more to the right than where it's currently at. So yeah, the keyboard controls are unusable but have better shifting, and the joystick controls are workable but would be better if the acceleration and braking could be separated from the turning controls, and then not having to use the one-button shifting and oh wait a minute, there's a way we can fix this with emulation. Here's the trick. When you activate joystick support in this game by pressing Ctrl-J, the keyboard controls still remain active. Plus, DOSBox supports multi-button and multi-axis controllers, such as a DualShock 4 gamepad or an Xbox 360 controller. So, depending on if you want to go with a dual analog setup or using the triggers for the gas and brake pedals, here's basically what you want to do using DOSBox's key mapper. First, make sure you set up the DOSBox config to handle joystick support for this particular game in the best way possible. I'll show these settings at the end of the video, along with the usual DOSBox config details. You'll also probably want to create a separate key mapping file for this game, since we're going to be making some pretty drastic changes. Secondly, open up DOSBox's key mapper while the game's loaded, and strip out all of the joystick controls, except for button 1. You'll probably still want that button set up so that you can select cars and skip past the gas station intermissions, although feel free to remove the mapping for it and then set it to a different button if it's getting in the way of where you want your shifting controls. Next, assign the left and right motions on joystick 1 to the left and right directions of whichever analog stick you're going to use on your gamepad. Probably the left stick, but hey, nothing against any of you who want to use the right stick for turning the car. Now, assign the acceleration and braking to either the up and down directions on the opposite analog stick, if you want to go with a dual analog setup, or assign them to the triggers if you want to emulate gas and brake pedals. And keep in mind though that DOSBox uses direct input, not X input, which means that Xbox controllers will read both triggers as opposite ends of one axis, meaning you can't press both at the same time and get a proper reading. But because of how the physics work in this game, that's probably not going to be an issue. Lastly, assign the A key to whichever button on your gamepad you want to upshift to higher gears, and the Z key to whichever button you want to use for downshifting to lower gears. Me personally, that's what I use the triggers for, as I kind of learned to play in racing games with a dual analog setup. And guess what? If you do all of this, the game will suddenly be 1,000,000 times more playable. The turning controls are still a little janky since it's relative steering, not absolute steering, but hey, I'll take it. Although, this fact unfortunately makes it impossible to properly play this game with an actual gaming steering wheel. but at least it's playing better than it was. Alright, one other option too, if you want to skip on using a gamepad and just use the keyboard, is to literally map the arrow keys on your keyboard to function as the axes on a joystick. So, yeah, seriously, even doing it that way makes the game more playable than just using the default keyboard controls. Overall, if you go back and play Test Drive on period-correct hardware, you're gonna absolutely hate the controls and wonder how anyone ever liked the game. But then at the same time this came out, there wasn't much to compare it to, short of arcade games. So people kind of accepted that they'd have to make concessions to get a similar experience out of a home computer. But the tech driving this game, no pun intended, was actually pretty solid. The fact that an 8 MHz computer could show these pseudo 3D graphics as well as it does, and with as high a frame rate as it does, is impressive. And the game actually runs really slow on anything less than an 8 MHz computer, but again, this was at a time when no one really properly noticed these kinds of things, so there's no mention on the box that a faster system is recommended. However, going back and playing this emulated with the controls remapped basically breathes new life into this thing and allows players to enjoy it in the most optimal way possible, which finally makes the game surprisingly playable. But still horribly repetitive. Seeing how the Test Drive series got its start is neat and all, but you're ultimately not missing much if you skip on this one, and go back to one of the later sequels instead. Although those have their own list of quirks to deal with, so I guess however you slice it, you're kinda screwed really. So on the plus side, DOSBox runs the game with the auto cycle setting perfectly fine. But for joystick support, you absolutely need to turn off timed intervals. Plus, if you plan to use a more advanced gamepad, you'll want to turn off button wrap and set the joystick mode to FCS so that you can use the D-pad if you so desire. Not to mention, you kinda have to do that to support the extra accesses too. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday will be episode 227, and we'll be taking a look at a game which has a title suggesting hardcore espionage action. But it's actually just a platformer. If you think you know which game that might be, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned because 2018's only just getting started. Thanks for watching everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.